Hello and welcome to Adult Music, the podcast with music for the mature mind. This is episode 161. I'm your co-host, Russ.
And I am your co-host, Mike.
It's a rainy night in Japan, Mike.
It is. I think it's going to be a rainy day tomorrow, too, which is not a very nice thing. I need the sun. I need the blue sky. I like the blue sky.
The blue sky.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be nice to see that. Before we get into this week's content, I want to say thanks to a few people. First, to pianist Zoltan Rogovic for sharing our episode last week. Be sure to check out his debut recording, Perspectives, a fine Hungarian pianist. We enjoyed his recording a lot. Also, thanks to Nick Finzer, trombonist and CEO of Outside and Music, the music label, for sharing our podcast as well. And don't miss his legacy recording, celebrating the music and trombone legacy of J.J. Johnson. We talked about that last week as well. Good recordings all the way around.
Yeah, and in classical music, nobody thanked us. Actually, the labels sometimes thank us, but the artists never do, it seems.
Lawo, what's the name of that label?
Oh, Lawo, the label, yeah. They gave us a thumbs up, which was cool. Yeah.
Well, we've got some bad news this week, Mike, so we may as well just get it out of the way.
Yeah, there's a lot of bad news, actually, and this is some big names here.
Yeah, several earthly departures. So let's roll out the theme. And there we go. We've got three people who have left us this week. We're going to start out with guitarist Calvin Keyes, who passed away on April 14th at the age of 82. He's originally from Omaha, Nebraska, and he has quite a resume over his career. He recorded or performed with Ray Charles, Ahmad Jamal, Jimmy Smith, John Handy, Bobby Hutcherson, Eddie Marshall, Sonny Stitt, Pharoah Sanders, Joe Henderson, and Leon Williams, among others. Keyes recorded 16 albums as a leader going back to 1971, starting out on the Black Jazz label. He recorded 3 albums for Gregory Howe's Wide Hive Records, and back in episode 81, Summer Strummin', we discussed his 2022 release, Blue Keys, on Wide Hive Records, and we liked that a lot. And we both ended up buying a copy of that, I believe.
We both have the CD. I have it. Yeah, that album's his last album.
Maybe,
yeah. Released during his lifetime, anyway.
He has a really unique style with some blues embedded and interesting jazz lines in his solos. I enjoyed it a lot.
Yeah, adult music podcast favorite.
So rest in peace, Calvin Keyes. Not in our usual classical or jazz realm, but I want to mention also a big figure who we lost this week. On April 18th, guitarist Dickie Betts, born Forrest Richard Betts, passed away at the age of 80. A founding member of the Allman Brothers Band, and then he took on the leadership role in the band really after Duane Allman passed away at a young age from a motorcycle accident. He led his own groups, including Great Southern, and Dickie Betts had a really unique style of using the major pentatonic scale a lot. He was influenced by jazz and country music and brought in that influence into the Allman Brothers sound. You could hear the jazz influence in songs like In Memory of Elizabeth Reed. And he wrote a lot of great songs, including, of course, probably his biggest hit, Ramblin' Man. What you mentioned at the start of the podcast, Blue Sky, something we'd hope to see. That's a really beautiful song. And you can also check out a video of him on YouTube, kind of jamming in a hotel room with Dangerous Dan Toller on guitar. And they're playing a very fast version of Horace Silver's The Preacher, if you want to hear some jazzy kind of country swing playing. Probably my favorite rock band of all time because of their multiple influences and great jamming, the Allman Brothers. And now I believe J-Mo, the drummer, is the last surviving member of the original group.
Yeah, just awesome playing for the Allman Brothers. There'll never be another band like them simply because the 70s will never come back. And in some ways, that's a good thing. But we're never going to have music like that. And that's a shame because I got to tell you, growing up in the 70s, in a way, we were really spoiled because you grow up and you think, oh, this is what music is like. And it was like some of the best music ever made. It was really unique, as far as popular music goes. Just fantastic grooves and musicianship.
Now you can't even find a guitarist on an album. And you had bands like that with dual lead guitars and 2 drummers, Hammond organ.
Yeah.
Yeah, I miss those days.
We need that. Well, we got some Hammond organ coming up. Not tonight, but,
Yeah, next week. So rest in peace, Dickie Betts. And finally, Mosaic Records co-founder, reissue supervisor, and Blue Note discographer historian Michael Koskuna passed away on April 19th. He was 75 years old and he'd been fighting cancer for some years. I think most jazz fans will know his work, but here's some more details I found on the website Tracking Angle by Michael Freemer. Cassadó started his career in the late 60s as a disc jockey and music journalist, writing for Downbeat and jazz and pop magazines. He moved on to producing records in the mid-70s for Capitol, Arista, Atlantic, Motown, and later on Blue Note. He won 3 Grammys, including Best Historical Album Producer in 1993 and 2002. He was a large figure in the 1980s Blue Note revival, where he focused on releasing previously unreleased records in the Blue Note and other label catalogs, and he supervised the release of more than 100 reissued albums, as well as producing new releases by diverse artists, including McCoy Tyner, Buddy Guy, Bonnie Raitt, Woody Shaw, and many others. And until recently, Cassadó administered the Francis Wolff photo catalog, which has a lot of jazz's most iconic images in it. If you have a record or CD collection from the 80s or 90s, you've more than likely heard the result of his work and read some of his great liner notes as well. Recently, I sent a scan of his extensive notes to a Woody Shaw release that someone who's going to be our guest host next week received, Mike, and that's guitarist Jason Kaiser. So anyway, rest in peace also to Michael Cassadó. Thanks for your devotion to the jazz world. And on to talking about Jason. Why would I send a guitarist the notes to Woody Shaw album? Well, we heard Jason Kaiser's great Shaw's Groove with cool arrangements of Woody Shaw compositions, and he was really excited. We were excited about it, and we've had a lot of back and forth, and I had this great compilation of Woody Shaw that Michael Cassadó had put together and had really good notes, so I scanned them and sent them to him a while back. And so we're kind of excited to introduce Jason's new release, which is coming out next Friday, Grassology.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a solo guitar release. And so he's going to join us in next week's episode, go through some classical jazz guitar releases, and then talk us through his new release. So it's going to be a lot of fun. So make sure you don't miss next week's episode.
So we're going to make a jazz guitarist talk about other guitar albums. We probably should have given him a bit of a variety there, but next time, I don't know.
Well, it'll be interesting.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
He'll know more than we do. So,
by the way, before we get into the classical music, I just want to mention that there's a new Charles Lloyd album out, which you kind of alerted me to, and I've got the CD now, and it comes with a booklet. And speaking of liner notes, the booklet liner notes for this album are absolutely incomprehensible. They're like, as are, they're sort of like in the mode of the those old 60s albums where they're kind of throwing stuff out, like hoping it's going to stick, like making the music sound like it's just can't be captured in words. And maybe that's true, but I don't know. It was quite a read, though, let me say. I couldn't understand any of it.
Mike, we're going to be up to about 1,000 albums by summertime that we've gone through.
We're not even close to my CD collection yet, though.
Yeah, but still, I average about 16 pages of notes per episode. So any artists out there who are listening, if you want a comprehensible and accurate description of your music and you'd like us to write the album notes for you, get in touch.
Yeah, but I think this guy was going for the old jazz liner note thing where they were kind of trying to set some kind of mood. I have about 8 pages of notes here. You have 16. How you do double what I do? God, it's amazing.
I've got all the information I need to put the episode online too mixed in there. So
it's
and that quite a work of art every week.
I've even got a rant in this one.
Oh, good.
Coming up right away.
All right. Well, before we get into the music for this week, in the episode description, you'll find links to Spotify and Apple Music for all of the music we'll discuss. And at the top of the description, there's a link to the full episode playlist. That's all the music in one place on Deezer. CD quality streaming music from France. You can also listen to the podcast on Deezer if you like. You can get the music and the podcast in one place. But if you can't see the full description or recording list and links on whatever app or platform you listen to us on, please come over and check us out on our host site. That's Podbean, PODBEAN.com. Everything is easy to follow for this and all previous episodes. If you enjoy the podcast, please follow or subscribe. Tell a music-loving friend about us to help us get new listeners. If you take a moment to give us a ranking or write a short review, it helps us get listed in the recommendations in the music categories. We were in the Apple Music Commentary list this week, Mike.
Yeah.
We pop in and out depending on how the algorithm goes, but reviews help us get moved up there. You can also come over and follow us on our Facebook page to get extra info and more new releases throughout the week. You can see our handsome faces and interaction with the artists and leave a message or comment there as well. And if you'd like to contact us directly with any comments or questions or requests for album notes, our email address is adultmusicpodcast, all one word, @gmail.com. We want to recommend another podcast that's the same difference. Two jazz fans, one jazz standard podcast run by our friends AJ and Johnny, who look at several versions of a jazz standard in each episode. They come out twice a month. They play little samples from each version, talk about the history of the original and the different versions, what they like and don't like. You get your history and a lot of humor all in one place and learn about jazz there. There's a link to their podcast in the description. If you stick around to the end of our episode, you can also hear their audio promo to find out more about what they do. Just like AJ and Johnny, we also play musical samples. You're going to hear a lot of them tonight. Here's our fair use disclaimer. Music sample clips are for commentary and educational purposes. We recommend that listeners listen to the complete recordings, all of which are available on streaming services in the links provided. And we also suggest that if you enjoyed the music, you consider purchasing the CDs or high-quality downloads to support the artists, just like Mike and I do.
Yeah, well, when we can afford it.
We can afford it, yeah.
When we're working with a currency that actually has value. You know? Anyway. Our first classical album, this is going to lead to a rant right away, even though this is a good album, okay, is our Baroque album for the week, Pergolesi, Stabat Mater, Vivaldi, Nisi, Dominus. So we have two vocal works here. The performers are Maarten Engeltjes, I think he's Dutch, countertenor and the conductor, Shira Patchornik, soprano for the Pergolesi, and Project Amsterdam, that's PRJCT. They've taken all the vowels out of that. Yeah. And they're the Baroque ensemble. This is on the Pentatone label, released on March 29th. Our first work on this album is by Pergolesi, Stabat Mater, P77 from 1736. Okay, remember when I was like ranting a few weeks ago about the computer code catalog numbers? P77 is acceptable. It's a P and then you have a number. Yeah. Okay, that's good. Do it like that, everybody. That's fine. Okay, now this work was composed and I guess first performed in 1736, the year Pergolesi died at 24 years old. He really was a brilliant composer who really didn't get a chance. Well, he did get a chance, but didn't get enough of a chance. Even Mozart lived longer than him by 11 years. So it's a real loss from way back. I mentioned this on the other podcast. We did Stabat Mater before. On that podcast, I mentioned that there was a short story about it was like a science fiction story where the scientists could bring someone from the past back to life, and they were deciding who to choose to give somebody another chance. And the person they chose was Pergolesi, because he had died so young. And in the story, I don't know the name of the story, and I haven't tracked it down, but apparently in the story, they bring him back to life so that he could compose more music, and instead he starts drinking heavily and just dies rapidly again. So
you can't change history.
Yeah, I just can't change history, I guess. Anyway, that's not really the way I want to remember him, though, by the story, but I just think it's an interesting thing. Before I talk about the music, now, I want you to listen when I talk about the music, because this is a really good performance, but I have a complaint to the people at Pentatone here. It really bugs me when the English translation of the Latin text is the one that follows the rhyme scheme of the Latin instead of the meaning. So the person who's doing the translation, and it's an old translation, they're following the rhyme scheme. They're trying to keep the rhyme scheme of the Latin, and they're changing the meaning slightly to keep that rhyme scheme. And that's a problem. It's a problem when the text is sung in Latin. Now, if you're saying the Stabat Mater as a prayer in church in English, the rhyme scheme is fine because it helps you remember the text. It's a very long text. Right. But when you're listening to music that's being sung in Latin, you want to know what those Latin words mean, because the music is echoing the Latin meaning. Okay? Right. It's being composed to what's being said in Latin, and you're losing that in the English translation because it's not really direct from Latin. Do you know what I mean? Let me show you what they did here. The first 3 lines of this are in Latin: Stabat Mater dolorosa, juxta crucem lacrimosa, dum pendebat filius. Okay? Now, the first and second lines rhyme, and then the third line rhymes with the 6th line. So you're going to have 2 lines that rhyme, and then the last line of each verse rhymes too. And the English text does that. Now, in English, what I just read in Latin means The suffering mother stands next to the tearful cross where her son is hanging. Instead of that, we get, at the cross her station keeping, stood the mournful mother weeping, close to Jesus to the last. All right, now, the mother is suffering, not weeping in the Latin text, okay? Mm-hmm. We can assume that she's weeping too, but It doesn't say that, all right? And if you're doing tone painting, which I don't think is really happening here, weeping and suffering would probably be two different, like, tone painting things, so we're kind of losing that. Also, Jesus' name isn't mentioned in the Latin text, nor is the fact that his mother will be there until the end, which it says, close to Jesus to the last, right? So the English text adds a lot of things that aren't there, and this matters, all right? So we want to focus on the meaning of the Latin words. Also, the English rhyming one is hard to understand at times. It's just so lame. You're just like, oh my God. It's just, some of the rhymes are really not good. But in Latin, it's fine. It's a very old poem. That said, you don't need a translation to pick up the emotion in this work. It's obvious from the music. And by the way, in the booklet, there's also a German translation that doesn't rhyme, so that's probably a good translation of the Latin. Okay. If you speak German, you could probably get it from there. Of course, you could always just program your Google Translate app to English, hold it over the Latin, and you'll see a more direct translation there. All right, so let's go through the music now, because that's what we're really here to talk about. So anyway, what I want to say is, record companies, when you record the Stabat Mater by Pergolesi or by anybody, do a translation from the Latin directly. Don't worry about the rhymes. We can see that the Latin rhymes, okay? And we're going to hear it in the music too. Anyway, track 1. This is a 12-section work on 12 tracks. Actually, it's more than 12 sections, but there are 12 tracks. Let's just say that. Track 1, Stabat Mater Dolorosa. This is the first line of the poem. This is a pretty quick, striding pace. I like the transparency of the organ and strings here. The organ has this really great sort of transparent sound to it. Both Engeltjes and Patchornik are heard on this track vocally, and their voices blend well. And I'm going to go for the first sample right to the entry of the vocals. This is about a minute in, so we'll start a little later in the track. Okay, so it's an operatic type of composition, but it's not an opera. And I think these two singers downplay the operatic quality a bit. And I think that's a good thing, actually. Although they still sound pretty operatic. They're not singing to pin you to the back of the wall. Anyway, Engeltjes vocally, I hope I'm saying his name right. Engeltjes vocally goes for something understated when he's in the spotlight, and it gives a sense of numbness that the scene itself evokes, so it's kind of a nice choice for the meaning of the text. Track 2, Cuius Animum Gementum. The music here has a more emphatic quality with its accents and loudly pleading string interjections. Shira Patchornik has a solo in this section and sings out with contrasting force and resignation. Track 3, O Quam Tristis. How sad. This is a duet. Pergolesi keeps the contrast between movements. This has a sweet, flowing quality to it, and it's sung rather operatically, especially by Patchornik in her fortes. Track 4, Que Medebat. This section has a more upbeat quality to it, believe it or not, despite the sadness of the text. The text talks about how Mary suffered, and Engeltjes has the solo here. Track 5, Quis es homo. It's a duet, and the text poses a rhetorical question, and the orchestration comes across as rather light in this performance. I guess I'm used to bigger orchestras, and I mentioned the transparency of the sound at the beginning. This track combines 3 verses of the poem, the music between them providing high contrast, particularly in the quivering, energetic third verse, but I've actually chosen to sample the opening of this, so let's hear that. It's a really beautiful, pure tone there from Patchornik. Track 6, Vidit Sum. These individual sections go by fast. Shira Patchornik gets the spotlight in this track, and I like her relatively understated approach. I'm going to go ahead to sample this a bit. This is about 37 seconds into the track. Some really painful dissonances in there. That was really nice. The ear really likes that. Track 7, Ea Mater, has a 3/4 rhythm with a heavy step. This is Maarten Engeltjes solo, and I want to give him a chance in the spotlight, so let's hear a little bit of this from the beginning. Track 8, Fac ut ardeat cor meum, a duet with emphatic setting on the rather pleading lines, begging God to allow the speaker to feel how Mary felt. This has some very appealing melisma in it, particularly on the ah vowel, and I'm a big fan of melisma, so I want to get ahead to that a little bit. Track 9, Sancta Mater. Multiplied combined verses are heard on this track. There are 5 verses here. The tempo is slower, but still rather quick and flowing. The verses are combined musically, too, in the same musical mode. Pergolesi has the voices sing one verse solo, then combines them in different ways for the remaining verses. It's a nice trick, more subtle, after so much obvious musical contrast. Track 10, Fac ut portem. This proceeds in short phrases, followed by a pause. Engeltjes making a lot of dynamics of the strings between pauses. Engeltjes also has the vocal here. Track 11, Inflammatus, triumphant sounding music here, sung by Patchornik, the soprano. The second verse features both vocalists. There really is a lot of proto-Mozart duetting in the work, and you heard a bit of it in track 8 when I sampled that. This is one example here in track 11 as well. And finally, track 12, Quando Corpus, and then the Amen. We turn to a more subdued and quieter version of the opening of the entire work. The vocalists duet on the words asking that their souls enter paradise after they die, and the music suddenly picks up an aggressive edge for the final Amen. Tracks 13 through 21 are a work by Antonio Vivaldi. We know him a lot from his violin works, the concertos, and they're very fast, slow, fast. But he wrote a lot of music for the church and the opera stage too, and research into that really started in earnest in the 1990s, and scholars have uncovered a lot of Vivaldi music that we weren't familiar with. It turns out that there's more than one side to Antonio Vivaldi. He's a very versatile composer. Anyway, this is called Nisi Dominus, and it's based on a psalm that contemplates the helplessness of people when God does not support their efforts. So it's pleading God to help them and say, they're saying that if God doesn't help you, you're going to fail, basically. Nisi Dominus means unless the Lord. So track 1, Nisi Dominus, the main idea here is, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. It's got a cheerful opening, which is a little surprising, but that's what we expect from Vivaldi, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is a lot more chipper than the Pergolesi, I guess because of the subject matter. But Vivaldi is the earlier composer. You want to remember that too. Pergolesi is really ushering in the classical era. In fact, the classical era, the era that Haydn and Mozart brought to its height, is said to begin with Pergolesi's opera La Serva Padrona, the servant as boss, effectively. And that's said to be the first classical work, 1734 or something like that. Anyway, Engeltjes is the only vocal soloist in the Vivaldi work, and we have some uplifting melisma in this opening section. There's a lot of melisma happening in this work, especially. Let's hear about 30 seconds in. Yeah, those leaping violin lines are pure Vivaldi. And in the vocals, I could make out some Handel, too, who came later. So I wonder if they studied these works. Track 14 is the second part, Vanum est nobis. It is vain for you. It's a slower movement with an appealing, breathy organ continuo playing along with the strings. There's a transparency and appealing spareness to this movement, leaving the voice exposed, and Engeltjes makes the most of it with his secure, vibrato-less tone. Track 15, Surgite, starts quickly with a rising line on the word surgite, which means rise, so we get a little tone painting here, and then goes into an opera recitative-like section. Track 16, Cum Dederit. This movement was used in the James Bond film Spectre with Daniel Craig, and has become popular really because of that. When I was a child, this work was unknown because nobody knew any of the Vivaldi vocal works. So here we go. We've got a pretty famous Baroque work here now because of that movie. It does have a sinister type of heartbeat rhythm to it. The first line is, when he shall give sleep to his beloved. And I want to sample part of the instrumental intro and then the vocals entry. So we'll start this about 50 seconds in. All right, very evocatively played there. The pace is really fantastic with that sort of throbbing heartbeat type beat and the softer vocal too. Does anyone recognize that from the Bond film? I don't know.
Been a while, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I saw this one. Anyway, track 17, Sicut Sagittae. Now, whenever you see the word Sagittae, you could just think Sagittarius, the archer. Sagittae is an arrow in Latin. There's little tricks to understand that. This is a contrasting, faster movement in 3/4. The vocal line gives Engeltjes some opportunities to show off a vocal tremolo that's very neatly performed. Track 18, Beatus Vir. This slower-paced movement exposed Engeltjes' voice again, and he fills the space appealingly with a floating legato line on the space's reverberations. Let me sample this from the beginning. It's a very brief movement. and I better get out there because that's half of the track already. Track 19, Gloria Patri. This is the ending Glory to the Father and to the Son part. It's a little separated from the psalm. This has a somber violin opening with organ playing, counterpoint, and chords. Engeltjes goes up high in his range for this, and he's got a solid tone all the way through his range. Impressive vocalizing on this track. Track 20, Sicut erat in principio, or principio. Whether that C is hard or soft depends on where you're from in Europe, I guess, because Latin was widespread back in the day. The next line of the Gloria Patri is set at a faster pace, and again, very impressive melisma singing from Engeltjes. And finally, the Amen, track 21. It features a lot of melisma on the A, and we leave in high spirits, and let's leave this particular album in high spirits and sample a bit of that. Okay, very appealing. If you want to hear more, you know where to go. We have the link in the program note. So this album is recommended mostly for the combination of the two compositions on it, which I'm not sure have ever been released on the same album before. The recording is transparent with a lightly weighted string orchestra with organ serving as continuo, and that's an appeal to me. I like the sound of the church organ a lot. The vocals are attractive and pretty straightforward, with little coloring of tone. Expression usually comes with the contrast of dynamic levels. The voices ring out strongly in harmonies. The performance comes across as a bit on the austere side in its more subdued sections. There's so many recommendable versions of the Pergolesi work, even recent ones with Jodi de Vos, which we heard in 2022 on episode 57. Which was called The Revolution Will Not Be Organized, one of our more creative titles. Also, Sandrine Piot and Lucille Richardot, two of my favorite singers, along with Jodi de Vos, sang this as well recently. There's even an Anna Netrebko recording with Antonio Pappano conducting that's vocally great. And of course, one of my favorite singers of all time, Emma Kirkby, sang this back in the day. I think the choice for me has to go in the direction of which singer you want to hear for this work. The vocalists on this album really aren't the stars of the recording, although they do deliver beautiful performances. The work itself is the star. It's a perfectly good, appealing performance of the Pergolesi. The Vivaldi is a work I've heard before but don't know very well, and I thought this was a captivating performance, not least due to Maarten Engeltjes' tasteful and highly musical vocal performance as countertenor. The entire performance, like the Pergolesi, is on the austere side, and that appealed to me, as it allows the bare bones of the music to be heard. So this is a recommendable album, though if you're coming for the Pergolesi, there are more dynamic versions out there. If you're here for the austerity, you might want to hear this one. It's all beautifully judged and performed.
I enjoyed these performances. The Pergolesi is really emotionally moving, especially if you follow along the texts. It's dramatic, and it has a lot of musical contrasts in it. I like the recording. The voices are front and center, but as you mentioned, without sort of additional adornment, they're rather subdued in performance, but they're captured richly on the recording, so they're always easy to hear in detail. And even if you're not paying attention by the end of the work, the Vivaldi comes out bursting with lots of motion right away. Yeah. But it doesn't stay that way. There's a lot of emotional variety here as well. And I really liked the tone of the organ that stands out in the Vivaldi work as the continuo, as you mentioned. It just sounds great on the recording. So I enjoyed both works and performances.
Yeah, I should have looked up what the organ was. It's one of those older church organs, not the really powerful ones that can bring the church down around it.
Right.
If you play it loud enough.
It has a nice rounded tone, though.
Yeah, it has a lot of character, the tone, and I really love those Italian church organs. If you go into an Italian church, an old Italian church with a really old organ, they just sound fantastic. They each have their own individual character. Really amazing. Anyway, our second album is a guitar album. Now, I have to tell you, next week we're going to do like a guitar episode.
Right.
And I really didn't know what to choose between this and the one I chose for next week, so I went for the contemporary composer for next week. And I really wanted to talk about this one. This is the complete solo guitar works of Gaspar, Cassadó, and Federico Mompou, one of my favorite composers. They're played by Eugenio Della Chiara, who's from Pesaro, Italy. So you have an Italian guy playing Spanish music here. And this is on the Naxos label, released 22 March 2024. The first composer we're going to hear is Gaspar Cassadó. He was born in Barcelona, as was Mompou. So this is really a Catalan, Barcelona-heavy album. Cassadó's father, Joaquim, was a composer, organist, and conductor. After moving to Paris in 1907, Gaspar studied with Pablo Casals and became a cello virtuoso, and I guess that's what he's known for, his cello playing. He commissioned works from several composers and composed and transcribed for himself. He lived in Florence, Italy, during the last years of his life, with his wife, the pianist Chieko Hara, who I'm guessing is Japanese. And he died of a heart attack a few weeks after the 1966 floods in Florence. Yeah, if you ever go to Florence, you can see pictures of that. They have them around in some of the shops in the city. It's still thought of and remembered today. So despite his precarious health at the time in 1966, he participated in fundraising concerts for his adopted city, and I guess that eventually killed him. Cassadó wrote 6 pieces for guitar, all of which are connected to his friendship with Andrés Segovia. I think every Spanish composer from the 20th century owes their guitar works to Segovia. He commissioned a lot of works from Spanish composers. Most of Cassadó's guitar works are based on folk music of Catalonia, except, of course, for the arrangement of the 2 Finnish songs that we're going to hear here. The first track is Catalanesca, so something about Catalan. This was written in 1922, so it's 102 years old. How about that? To all extents and purposes, this is a sardana. A sardana is a traditional Catalan circle dance accompanied by a cobla, which is an ensemble of mostly wind instruments. There's razor-sharp, clear sound on the guitar, so this comes in as a nice surprise, and you're just captivated right away. Let's sample the opening. That was only 30 seconds, but we heard a lot of music in there.
Yeah.
It really sounded like a lot was packed in. So we heard the pluck chords at the beginning. They're very pianistic in nature, despite the piece being written for the guitar. I like Della Chiara's shaping of the melody, with retards at the end of some phrases. It's a nice touch. He's able to change his sensitivity according to the line and gets a lot of touches out of the instrument. The middle section is especially evocative of Spain. Let me give you a little taste of that from about 1 minute and 15 seconds in. Now, in Della Chiara's performance here, I'm hearing a lot of tension between keeping the rhythm going and wringing out the kind of longing sort of passion from the melody. So they seem kind of like at odds with each other. It's a pretty interesting piece. I also like the way he signals the ending section with a change of tonal color, plucking the strings hard for a more nasal sound. Track 2, Preambulo y Sardana. So we have another sardana after a prelude. This starts with a full contemplative tone, sensitively played. Della Chiara allows a lot of space to make the prelude breathe. At 1 minute and 55 seconds, the sardana starts after a brief introduction, and I wanted to sample this sardana too. There's some lovely harmonic effects in the middle of the track, and the dance rhythms patterns change from section to section. This piece is really very spare in its harmony. Track 3, Dos Cantos Populares Finlandeses. So that's going to be Finnish folk songs. It's a different character from the Spanish dance pieces. The melodies are pretty. The two songs are connected in this work, and I'm guessing the second one begins either at 2 minutes or at around 2 minutes and 24 seconds. There might just be a connecting bridge in there. This one is a bit more active rhythmically than the previous one, being that the previous one was a dance too. It's kind of surprising. The end of the track features the hitting of the body of the guitar to produce a sound. We're not going to hear that, but let's hear the beginning of the second of the two folk tunes. And we get that nasal sound there at the end. I should have let it go a little bit more, maybe. But I like his Delicatas, like kind of lively rhythms, too. It's really important to put these pieces across. Track 4, Canción de Leonardo. This is composed in memory of Andres Segovia's son, whose untimely death was caused, it says here in the notes, by an electric bolt. So I looked into this a little bit. We found out he was electrocuted at age 13 when hitting a railroad power line near Versoix, Geneva. And that's not really clear either. How did he hit the railroad power line? What was he doing? Anyway, it's not stated in any of the newspaper articles. They were very discreet. It's the only guitar piece by Cassadó that is not explicitly tied to popular music. It seems to be meant as a sweet lullaby cradling Segovia's deceased son. It's a rather sad piece. It opens gently with harmonics, followed by the 3/4 rocking lullaby rhythm. It's very touching. I always wonder about pieces like this. It must have been really painful for Segovia to play something like that.
Sure.
The fifth track, Sardana Chigiana, from 1951, was composed to celebrate Segovia's appointment as a professor at the Accademia Musicale Chigiana of Siena, in Italy. We're back to the cheerful spirits of the opening sardanas here. This one is a bit fanfare-ish in its theme, probably to emphasize its celebratory nature. And finally, track 6, Leyenda Catalana, which was composed before 14 December 1952. It's based on a Catalan Christmas folk song, El Noi de la Mare, which others had arranged as well. On this recording, bars 80 to 84 have been cut to make the ending more effective. The piece has a lovely lilt to it. It remains on the quiet side. And for me, this piece oddly never gets going. I think it has to do a lot with the frequent slackening of the rhythm when the music departs from the lilting figure. It remains calm throughout, though. We move on to Federico Mompou. He was also born in Barcelona, as I mentioned, and was a pianist, but a concert of Fauré's works pushed him toward composition. I should mention, by the way, 2024 is the 100th anniversary of Fauré's death, so it's probably fitting that we're at least talking about him here. He studied piano in Paris. This is Mompou. Studied piano in Paris from 1911, and that really shows because Impressionism, not really a good word to describe what was happening in French music, but that was in the air at the time. Those wonderful, colorful harmonies that we hear in Debussy, Ravel, and even in jazz as well from Bill Evans and pianists inspired by him. The Second World War influenced Mompou's return to Barcelona. There he married pianist Carmen Bravo in 1957. And I guess he lived there under the Franco regime for the rest of his life. Tracks 7 to 8, the famous Cançó i Danzas. I love these. This is number 10 from 1953. It was arranged for Segovia to play by Mompou himself. It was originally for piano, and there's a vocal quartet version too, which I've never heard. I'd be intrigued to hear that.
Wow.
It's based on two of the medieval Cantigas de Santa Maria by King Alfonso X the Wise, whose archaic tone is reflected in Mompou's sober and religious harmonization. The cançó, or the song, track 7, marked Larghetto molto cantabile, is a chorale, so it's sort of chords that you would sing in church, really, if you were a Protestant mostly. The original cantiga vocal line was sung by the soprano, or is in the upper voice in this version, while the lower voices are all Mompou's doing, so he composed that over the already existing melody. Let's just hear the opening of this. I can see why guitarists would want to play these works. They just have this wonderful, antique Spanish quality to them. But I have to say, they sound so much better on the piano, just because those harmonies generate a lot of harmonics that really fill the sound out. And the guitar doesn't have that capability, really. But they still sound great here. A lot of Mompou's music really rides on the harmonics that are produced by the chords that he writes for the piano. So the character of this work changes on the guitar from the piano, and you would expect that. The melody's lovely, and it comes across with great sensitivity in Della Chiara's hands, as you heard. Now the danza, or the dance, marked amabile, we hear the original cantiga melody here in the top voice too. The arrangement and Della Chiara himself get a lighter tone out of this, and it dances lightly and delightfully. Again, though, I think this works better on the piano, but this is a satisfying, compact performance. Tracks 9 and 10, Cançó i Danza number 13. So, Mompou wrote 14 of these works, and 13 of them were for the piano. This is the one that wasn't for the piano. It was originally for the guitar. And Della Chiara is playing this from the manuscript, not from the printed score. This was not written for André Segovia, interestingly enough. It was written because of the acquaintance between Mompou and the Spanish guitarist Narciso Yepes, who we remember, I think, from our youth. He was still recording then. So track 9, Cançó, is named El Cant dels Ocells, so the Song of the Birds, a harmonization and personal elaboration of a Catalan Christmas folk song. There's an introduction, then at 23 seconds, the melody for the song starts. Again, very sensitively played. It's very straightforward, and the focus seems to be more on the melody than the harmony in the composition. Track 10 is the danza El Bon Cazador, which means the good hunter. Because this performance originates with Mompou's manuscript, this movement is less unbridled than it is in most recordings, because the metronome marking on the manuscript is slower, and the composer's expressive indications allow the performer to indulge in nuances, which is what Della Chiara does here. It's a brief dance, and I think it works a lot better at this tempo than we usually hear. There's a pretty harmonic arpeggio at the conclusion of one phrase, and the piece ends satisfyingly. Let's just get a sample of the beginning. doing some nasty harmonies in there towards the end, too. I could see why you'd want that to be a little slower, too. You really want those to be heard. Sounds great. Tracks 11 through 16 are a big work, Suite Compostellana. This piece came into being due to the relationship between Mompou and Andre Segovia. Segovia commissioned this piece with the instruction that it be inspired by Galicia. The title and piece itself refer to the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela, which a lot of people make, and perhaps some of our listeners have made. I myself have never done it. Track 11 is the first movement, Preludio. It's unsettled, uneven, and cadenced as a pilgrim's stride, but it is sometimes interrupted by espressivo sections. It begins almost like raindrops from the guitar, with arpeggiated patterns. One can imagine someone starting out on their pilgrimage to the church in Santiago de Compostela, and it raining outside. Let's listen. You can hear a little bit of a Bach influence there, too. Mompou was really steeped in the music of the past, and especially the distant Spanish past, like Renaissance era, and maybe even before that. Track 12, the second movement, Chorale. It's austere, reminiscent of a majestic cathedral, and it's written as block chords, not the most natural sound for a guitar, but one that evokes church chorales, as this one should. It's rather subdued in this performance, perhaps with its head bowed at the Mass. There's an especially appealing dissonance at around 1 minute and 55 seconds, a sort of tease before the piece goes on in its more tonal fashion, and it ends with a subdued chord. Track 13, Cuna, a hypnotic lullaby. Here I was struck by Della Chiara's lovely, lightly vibratoed tone in the opening arpeggios of this gentle movement. Let's hear a little bit of that. And now you start hearing those harmonies creep in, one of my favorite elements of Mompou's music. It's a very spare sort of work. It proceeds simply throughout, with the same pattern being sequenced at different registers until the pattern changes and the process continues. At around 1 minute and 54 seconds in, the melody emerges with changing harmony, and the piece feels like it frees up a bit or gains a little boldness. Track 14, Recitativo. A heartfelt and hesitant speech. A recitativo, of course, is the spoken part before the aria in an early opera. Della Chiara characterizes this with a strong tone at the opening and manipulates the timbral color he gets to distinguish between certain melodic patterns. The rich lower harmonies heard in the first minute suggest brooding, and there are occasional colorful dissonances in the subdued line. Track 15, Canción. This is the fifth movement. The tension from the recitativo is dissolved here, and this comes across like one of the songs in the canzo y danza pieces. There's a mostly square, folk song-like quality to the melody, and it's appealing in its simplicity. Let's hear the beginning. We get a contrasting section to that folk melody. There's a departure in the middle, which doesn't happen in the canzoni danza pieces, and it returns to the opening simple melody. So it's an ABA structure. Track 16, the sixth movement, and this is the final movement, Muniera. It's a traditional Galician dance representing the end of a journey. So we have arrived at Santiago de Compostela by the end, and let's sample a bit of that. You're never going to hear a melody orchestrated the same way twice in a Mompou piece. He's got so many harmonic ideas. It's fantastic. So we heard the joyous feeling there, which Della puts across with grace. At 1 minute and 21 seconds, there's a new section with a pull-off figure, still rhythmic but a little slower. Della handles the return to the opening dance well with a teasing pause between sections. He gets a great full sound on the plucked block chords. So here on this album, we get a sensitively played traversal of these works by composers who mainly composed for other instruments. The Catalan quality comes out of the Cassadó sardanas, and I found his tribute to Segovia's son touching. The two Mompou canzoni danzas come across well, number 10 losing a bit of color in its guitar arrangement, but these are both so appealing and satisfying that one still gets lost in them. I was especially happy with the slower tempo used in the danza number 13. It allowed the harmonies to really come through more. The major work on the album is Mompou's Suite Compostelana. It comes across as spare and rather ascetic. All in all, Eugenio Della Chiara does these works ample justice, and I'm glad to have all of these guitar works collected onto a single album. I enjoyed his full sonorous sound on the guitar throughout the album.
The material here has got a sparseness to it that brings your focus to the tone, the melody, and his lyrical playing. Della Chiara is really up for that task. His tone rings with warmth. He captures subtle dynamic nuances in the pieces from both composers. And Mompou's works, especially the first one, being originally piano work, it's based around chords a lot, and he brings the full harmonic sense while also bringing out the melodies with varied articulation and really endearing phrasing. I thought it's a very mature and satisfying performance, and music that sounds a lot different from a lot of the pyrotechnical guitar works we often hear. I just like the focus of musicality, tone, and harmony in these works.
All right, our contemporary composer for this week is Stephen Dankner, his 4 sonatas for violin and piano. These are performed by Joana Genova on violin and Willis Delony on piano. And this is released on the Centaur label on April 5th, 2024. It's a double album, but it's not very long. It's a little less than 90 minutes total. Let me tell you a little bit about the Centaur label. I think this is the first time we're doing a recording that they've released on this podcast. They're based in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in the USA, and they were founded by Victor Saxey in 1976. I remember records on this label from the late 1980s when I first found out about them. I had a few of those early CDs, which sadly I don't have anymore. I don't know what happened to them, but I do have some Centaur records in my collection, or CDs in my collection, I should say. Naxos currently acts as the label's distributor, which is why we're able to get them here in Japan. Now, Stephen Dankner was born in Brooklyn, like me. How about that? So we were both born in Brooklyn, and we both apparently have a love of Brahms, because Dankner seems heavily influenced by Brahms in these works. And the violinist Joana Genova and pianist Willis Delony are friends of the composers and have performed his music often. And Genova is Bulgarian, and she now lives in Vermont. And apparently Delony is American. I'm not really sure where he's from. But they're the duo on this album. And we are indeed in really good hands. They play this music exceptionally well. You really couldn't ask for a better, especially first recording of these works. On CD1, or really just the first track on your streaming, we have Sonata Number 1 for violin and piano in one movement, written in 1992. This work starts adagio and morphs to an agitated allegro. Dankner says the work takes on a 19th century Mittel-European Romani flavor, with vivacious and colorful writing for both instruments. The music also gets passionate in the second theme. The development climaxes in a Romani-like violin cadenza. There's a recap and a coda in which the piece ends rapturously. Before I talk about this, let's just hear this and get into this sound world. Violin Sonata Number 1, the opening. So the beginning unfolds rather slowly, and I was rather surprised, and it really caught my ear that the piano comes in as sort of a fugue theme.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sort of made the opening violin line, which we thought was just going to be a melody, into a sort of fugue theme, or possibly even a canon, but I don't think it moves as a canon. I think the material changes too much. It progresses differently than the violin and the piano. This is a good recording, as you heard, and a beautiful tone on the violin, with full present tone on the piano as well. The piano is also very present and upfront, sort of a dangerous thing to do if you're a recording engineer. I remember from my recording engineering days, the piano can really pin the levels, but this sounds fantastic throughout. There's a sense of dimensionality to the recording. The idiom of this work, and really all the works on this album, is romantic. I guess you'd call it neo-romantic. It's got harmony that the Romantics really wouldn't have used. Melody drives this work, and at 2 minutes and 24 seconds, the Romani theme starts. I'm going to play a sample of that as well. We'll get to a cadence sometime soon, but I don't know when. Even this puts me in mind of Brahms a little bit, because Brahms said a lot of sort of folk music from the Hungarian refugees that he heard in Hamburg when he was there. So that theme rises in passion. There's some fantastic figuration in there for both instruments. At 4 minutes and 38 seconds, the violin reaches resolution on a very high note, then goes further to introduce the next slower section, another little surprise, which the piano introduces solo. The violin returns at 5 minutes and 25 seconds to have its say about this section. At about 5 minutes and 50 seconds, we hear a slow, passionate theme in the violin, really right out of 19th century Europe. Let's sample that as well. Briefly starts to break up there. Let's say early 20th century Europe. That reminded me a bit of Erich Wolfgang Korngold, actually. This slower theme goes on until about the 8-minute and 50-second mark, where a sort of demented dance begins. It ends with a passionately played violin cadenza. At 10 minutes and 26 seconds, the piano enters to accompany this cadenza's melodic material. There's a sense of pausing for breath or energy at 10 minutes and 50 seconds, then the dance begins again. The violin goes into another solo episode at 12 minutes, which the piano breaks up by repeating the violin's lines. Sections develop at length and slowly morph into other familiar sections in the recapitulation. At 18 minutes and 45 seconds, a resolution is reached, but after a brief pause, the piece continues into a coda, which may have started before this, actually. The piece finally reaches an end with violin double stops and some heavily weighted chords on the piano. Not only is this work romantic, it's dramatic and filled with strong emotion. And again, another thing about the Brahmsian influence, you never really knew when a Brahms development section ended and recapitulation began, or when a recapitulation ended and a coda began, because he sort of elided them or disguised them. And Dankner does that as well, so I couldn't really tell where the coda was, but I could tell, oh, this is the coda now, once we were in it. Tracks 2 and 3 are Sonata number 4 for violin and piano, which were also composed in 1992. Now you might ask yourself, what's going on here? We went from Sonata 1 to Sonata 4, both composed in 1992, yet Sonata 2 and 3, when were they composed? We'll get to that. Dankner says this has a complicated history. The two movements here in this violin sonata were originally the second and third movements of his first violin sonata. So that first movement work was originally a 3-movement work, which was about as long as Schoenberg's first string quartet, which is 45 minutes long in one movement. The first movement of the first sonata became the entire work. Dankner returned in 2019, did some editing and made some minor changes, making it his 4th violin sonata. It's kind of nice programming on the albums. He's put this after the first violin sonata because you could listen to them all the way through. And if you're listening on CD or just letting the stream go, you probably would. I personally listened to them on different days because there was a lot of detail and I was doing some pretty intense listening here. So track 2 is the first movement, Andante, Risoluto con brio. This starts like the first sonata with a solo violin, in this case lamenting in its theme. It's touchingly played by Genova. The piano comes in with non-legato accompaniment, mostly chords, and I'm going to sample from around that point. Well, very expressive violin playing in that line. It's a lovely melody in the Romantic tradition. The writing for the violin is very fine, and both musicians are superbly in sync with this music. The piano tends to have clipped sort of lines while the violin plays legato. It's an odd effect, one that has the quality of separating the two instruments in the ear. At 4 minutes and 5 seconds, there's a music box quality in the high end of the piano as the theme we heard earlier comes back momentarily, leading to violin figuration that's nevertheless expressive. In the 6th minute, there's sort of a resigned quality to the violin's double stops, but Dankner keeps the material morphing to new moods. Shortly after, the violin is playing with more passion. At 7 minutes and 15 seconds, it sounds like a resolution has been reached, but the piano suddenly introduces a new mood, playing a new theme, solo. The violin enters after a long solo section for the piano with a lively, dance-like theme, sort of like a folk dance, perhaps a Romani tune. The violin has most of the interest here as the piano sets the rhythm. I like how clearly the piano is captured on the album, and part of that is the clarity with which Delony plays. He's very discreet with his pedaling, enabling the individual tones to come up clearly defined. In the 11th minute, a romantic theme with arpeggiated accompaniment begins. We're in a more passionate mode here, with the violin soaring to its highest range as the section continues. The music quiets down for the conclusion as the built-up tension on the work sounds like it's unraveling. The movement has a serene ending. The second movement, track 3, and the final track on CD 1, if you're listening on CD, is marked Allegro risoluto. It has a lively opening with the violin and piano playing their own versions of the short phrases that open the work, often concluding each other's lines. Let's listen. Now, just in the sound of the material there, I'd say it's more neo-romantic than romantic, so I think we're kind of more in the 20th or even 21st century there. At the 1 minute mark, there's a pause, followed by a slower, more melodic section. There's a winding down of tension, leading to a new theme at 2 minutes and 23 seconds, which sounds like a more romantic variation on the opening line. In fact, in the 4th minute, there's another variation on the opening theme, this one with a dance-like feel. I really enjoyed the pizzicato accompaniment at the 4 minute and 20-second mark, and I'd like to sample that. That resolution just kept being put off. I kind of feel like those violin pizzicatos almost sounded like part of a piano, like it was like a prepared piano or something. It was really an interesting effect. After this point, we come to a stretched out melody in romantic mode. The movement is effectively a set of variations on the opening material, I think. Each new take on the theme is equally appealing, Dankner showing that he has a lot of creative ideas he can use on his material. Once again, the violin reaches a cadence on a high note, then there's a brief, energetic coda at the end of the movement. Okay, now, depending on whether you're listening on streaming or CD, the tracks are going to be different. So I'm going to say if you're on CD, this is track 1 on CD 2, tracks 1 through 4, it would be tracks 4 through 7 on streaming. Sonata number 2 for violin and piano, composed in 1999. The first movement is serious and stately and ends in a harmonic haze. So the violin starts in its lower range, plays a sensitively taken line. The piano accompanies with block chords. The melody subtly changes in rhythmic shape as it plays. At the end of the movement, the violin starts an ostinato line that ends on a high note, and then we have that harmonic haze that was mentioned in the program notes. Track 2 on the CD, or 5 on streaming, is the second movement, Allegro molto. Virtuosity is required in this stridently accented movement, according to Dankner. It slows down at the end and goes into the next movement without a pause. I'm going to fade this up from the beginning just because of the way it kind of connects to the previous track. So let's listen to this. I really like the controlled wildness that the performers provide there. The piano plays rapid cascades of notes as the violin speeds up and picks up some double-stopped chords along the way. The piano is busy throughout this movement. The movement royals most of the way through, and there are some brief, gentler interludes. The duo play with great urgency for the most part. Track 6 on streaming, or 3 on the CD, 2, is the third movement, Tempo di Tango. This was composed under the influence of Astor Piazzolla, according to Dankner. Like Piazzolla, Dankner says he seeks to emulate the ability to compose in native, popular, and contemporary classical musical idioms. This starts as a slow tango. The middle of the movement gets away from the tango rhythm, and we hear some firmly stated lines from the violin. The tango rhythm returns for the end of the movement. The violin reaches for a high note toward the end. Then there's a coda that sets up the next movement, which is movement 4. This is track 7 on streaming, or 4 on the CD. A poco meno mosso. This continues the tango until a climax is reached. Then a curtailed recap of thematic elements heard in the first 2 movements emerge. Dankner calls it a reminiscence of past emotions half remembered. I think we all know what that's like, especially at our age.
Yeah.
A coda recalls the essence of the tango, with the piano's lowest bass notes droning the incessant dance pattern, as if from a great distance. The piece ends in the harmonic haze that the opening movement ended with, which Dankner calls the clouds of time. So at the beginning we have a sustained bass note from the piano leading us into this movement. The piano opens its solo, setting the harmony, after which the violin comes in with a passionately played line. There are some sensitively played sections such as that after the 1 minute mark, so I'm going to start at about the 1 minute mark. Let's try that. Again, stretching out that material. At the 4 minute and 12 second mark, a section ends, and we hear rippling piano arpeggios that lead to an extended approach to a final resolution at the end. The approach quiets down with shy pizzicati in the violin and a ringing bass note in the piano. The violin ends the movement on a high harmonic. Tracks 8 to 11 on streaming, or 5 through 8 on CD2, are Sonata number 3 for violin and piano, composed in 2014, so not so long ago. This piece is a conscious look back at the past, with Brahms figuring highly, according to Dankner. That's not me saying that. So track 8, or 5 on the CD, 8 on streaming, is the first movement, Andante Comodo. It's got a pretty piano opening. I'd like to sample that. Yeah, this does have a strong Brahms quality to it. This movement really is a straightforward and lyrical movement in sonata form. It's beautifully played, all the sweetness of Joana Genova's tone coming through. There's even a repeat of the exposition, as in the 19th century. At the 3 minute and 5 second mark, the development section begins, and it's highly tuneful as well. Even when moving through different key areas, it keeps up its melodic appeal. There are a few brusque moments to add some drama, and 4 minutes and 42 seconds were in the recapitulation, and the sweet melodies of the opening are heard again. The movement is slightly heavy for a salon piece, but it's highly melodic and very appealing. Really very Brahmsian. I shouldn't even mention the salon here. This is kind of harmonic content in this. Track 9 on streaming, 6 on the CD, is Movement 2, Allegro Marziale. This contrasts to the first movement. It's in B minor and feels desolate. It's the key that represented death for composers of the past. And the piano begins the movement with a creeping chord pattern. The violin comes in with a heavily bowed figure that repeats and is then built on. Let's hear that opening. Okay, I was waiting for that cadence again. While the movement is a contrast to the first movement, it's hardly white-knuckle stuff. Dankner seems unable to write down an ugly sound, although these are kind of aggressive, let's say. And this all falls on the ear with a bit of weight, but nevertheless appealingly. Track 10 on streaming, or 7 on CD2, is the third movement, Lento. There's a ponderous piano opening that recalls César Franck's violin sonata's slow movement to my ear. Let's hear that. The movement moves with a mechanical sort of ponderousness, the violin always beautifully playing legato lines. It's a pretty ponderous movement and abstains from fireworks. It's got a gentle ending on a brushed-out violin double-stopped chord. The final track, 11 on streaming, or 8 on CD2, is the final fourth movement, Allegro Appassionato. This combines agitated and heartfelt. The first movement's theme is heard again at the end, simplified and extended here. This begins with a rising figure in both violin and piano and breaks into a rhythm after that. There's a light circusy feel to the rhythm. The opening aggressive theme ends on a full stop. Then at 1 minute and 34 seconds, a new section starts, starting lyrically, but building up to something more aggressive. Let's listen to that more aggressive theme. I really hate to fade out that beautiful theme. I mentioned that the section plays between the lyrical and aggressive, as you just heard, what Dankner calls the agitated and heartfelt in his note. This section has what sounds like an ending to the movement at 4 minutes and 18 seconds on a full stop. But after a pause, a more banged out piano line starts a new section with a more agitated violin line. There's a sweet finishing line on the violin at the very end, and we hear the opening piano line from the first movement to give us a sense of security and completion at the end. This is highly enjoyable music, fully in the romantic idiom. It's tuneful, passionate, and at times virtuosic. The recorded sound is impeccable, and both instruments are caught clearly in all their beauty of tone. The piano is not an easy instrument to capture, but this particular recording has it sounding ideal, and that's in no small part due to Willis Delony's discreet pedaling, and sure touch. Stephen Dankner seems to have traditional beauty built into his musical soul, so that even the rougher, more aggressive sections of his music still come up with an appealing musical sense to them. Despite the romantic idiom of the music, I'm amazed at this composer who can make such a familiar approach sound like it still belongs in our contemporary musical world. These are all immediately appealing works that can heal the soul of the onslaught of modern life with their musical beauty.
Yeah, I enjoyed these a lot. Dankner has a real gift for writing engaging melodic lines throughout everything. The music is romantic in nature, as you say, and right away I was thinking of Brahms from the start listening to it.
Me too.
Then you get that more modern harmonies that come in, and you know that you're further along in our modern time here. The piano parts are interesting as well. Always my ear is drawn to all the interesting things and changes in the accompaniment parts, and they're taking a real active role along with the violin. And there are lots of startling moments of beauty, too. I was really hit by the end of the first movement in Violin Sonata 3. It just sort of woke me up into a place of real beauty. So make sure you don't miss that ending there. Fine performances, as you said, with a lot of musicality and beautiful phrasing of the melodies in here and building tension. Great tone on the violin and an overall great sounding recording, too. If you think that contemporary classical music is scary or hard to listen to, just take a listen to this recording to dispel all of those wrong beliefs.
Yeah, indeed. And I also want to say we're far away from the 20th century now, so you should turn to your contemporary composers. They've gotten into a more tonal idiom these days, most of them. And the other ones are working with the timbral combination, so they're pretty interesting too.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, over on the jazz side, we've got a lot of variety for you tonight, and we're going to start out and stay for a bit of time in Europe, starting in Spain with the Arturo Serra Quintet. Dark Side, Light Side. This is on New Steps Records. It was released on April 12th, and we're going to have some nice vibes to start the program out. Born in Valencia, Spain, Serra studied percussion and classical music at the Conservatory of Valencia. He started playing jazz as part of the big band Sedavi in Valencia as well. He studied with teachers like Gary Burton, Ed Sandin, Jerry Bergonzi, and David Santoro. If I hear Jerry Bergonzi, I think Boston. Maybe he was at Berkeley for a time. He has worked with internationally acclaimed musicians Jerry Bergonzi, Dave Santoro, Dick Oates, Joe Magnarelli, fine trumpet player, and he leads his own groups, quartet, quintet, and sextet. And this recording, we've got the quintet format with Arturo Serra vibraphone, Antonio Gonzalez on alto sax, Juan Gallardo on piano, Pedro Campos on bass, and Santi Colomer on drums. And the recording is going to start out with a tune called The Backbeat, Horace Silver composition from his 1957 recording, The Stylings of Silver, with the Horace Silver Quintet. It's a quirky Silver composition. They're always fun. This seems a bit faster than the original. There's a 12-measure intro with repeated notes into phrases over stop time. Sax and vibes work the melody lines together. It gets into the main 16-measure melody section that has repeated syncopated bass notes underneath that change up to walking. That repeats, and there's a final 16-measure section that leads into a break, into a vibes solo from Serra. Let's pick it up from the break into the solo. Yeah, swinging with some speedy mallet work there, but a nice relaxed feel, and that's Gonzalez off on an alto solo from there. I like his tone and snappy phrasing, and Gagliardo has a piano solo too, with right-hand lines that change direction quickly. Vibe sax and piano trade eights with Colomer's drums for a round back into the main melody, and a little ending section with pretty piano and vibe ripples. Track 2 is Stormy Wonder, an original composition by the pianist here, Juan Gagliardo. It's got an even beat and a repeating bass and left-hand piano rhythmic figure that make an 8-measure intro. The melody is a repeating 20-measure idea that turns kind of minor bluesy in the second half. Sax and vibes work the lines together. Let's hear One Time Around this melody. More, and Gonzalez is up first on sax to solo, so let's pop back in to hear some of what he plays on this tune. Nice phrasing and bluesy tastes, and Serra's following there with a vibe solo with rhythmic excitement. Another time around the melody and repeats of the syncopated ending phrase lets Colomer beat up some hard excitement on the drums. Track 3, Jean-Marie, and this is a tune by pianist Ronnie Matthews on bassist Sam Jones's 1978 Visitation album that featured Bob Berg on tenor sax and Ted Masahino on the trumpet. The intro keeps the forceful minor modal idea of the original's intro, but they keep it down to 8 measures. Instead of the alternating lines started by Hino's trumpet and Berg's sax on the original here, vibes and sax have staggered lines before they come together. It's a 3/4 meter with an AABA structure. The B section changes up to a little major sweetness. Then Campos is off on a bass solo. Let's hear this tune get going. A nice deep woody toned bass there. Serra has a solo next, and he's followed by Gagliardo, who builds up some nice modal tension on this one. So let's check out the piano solo. Gonzalez gets around on sax too before a final run through the melody. Track 4, Duke Ellington's Sound of Love, a Charles Mingus composition from his 1974 album Changes One. This is a pretty ballad melody handled in unison by vibes and sax, with Gonzalez getting a section for sax to take the center stage. At this tempo, it takes more than 2 minutes to get through the melody, so let's jump in for some of Serra's subtle vibes solo on this tune. Gonzalez is back there from the previously heard sax line, and Serra joins back in to finish out the melody. A very nice treatment of this song. Track 5, the title track, Dark Side, Light Side. This is a composition by pianist George Cables from his 1975 debut recording, Why Not? You can also hear it on his 1997 album of the same name, Dark Side, Light Side. The drums bring in this modal tune with throbbing bass lines and piano chords for the 8-measure intro. Cables' cascading piano lines from the original are handled by unison vibes and sax. The melody is a 16-measure structure going around twice. It sounds cool in this arrangement with nice drum fills from Colomer. Let's check it out. On this tune, Gonzalez has a slinking sax solo followed by Serra's vibes and Gagliardo's piano before just once more through that interesting melody again. Track 6, Bouquet, a composition by trumpeter Tom Harrell from his 1986 recording Open Air, and he also recorded it with Phil Woods on 1989 album of the same name, Bouquet. Tom Harrell's a great composer, in addition to being one of the most inventive trumpet players. Here, vibes and sax get his 24-measure melody together at a perfectly relaxed tempo. The repeating figure that gets modulated around really sticks in your ears. Serra's solo has fine melodic ideas, a light touch, and relaxed phrasing. Let's check out Gonzalez's sax solo on this one. Yeah, very nice phrasing, and they get back to Harold's melody there to finish it up with a very pretty ending. Track 7, Barbara, another tune by Horace Silver. This is from his 1975 album Silver and Brass. The original recording had Tom Harrell, Bob Berg, 5 more brass players, and 2 more reed players on it as well. It's a 6/8 tune with an easy-flowing melody on vibes and sax. The melody is kind of an A-B-A-B format with 8 measure sections, except the final B is extended to 12 measures. And then there are 2 more measures with rhythmic figures as a transition section before solos from Gonzalez, Serra, and Gagliardo. Serra's solo on this one is quite charming with snappy licks and zippy lines, so let's hear a little bit of his vibe solo on this tune. After the solos, when they get back to the melody, and then that final transition section from before becomes a vamp to a slightly slowed ending. And the recording ends up with track 8, Silent Rain, a Kenny Barron composition from his 1991 Kenny Barron Trio recording The Moment that had Rufus Reid and Victor Lewis on it, but this was a solo piano number, and it's a very pretty tune, and Serra does it solo on the vibes. It's rubato and ringing, and he keeps it lush and dreamy in atmosphere. Let's take a listen to it get started. Oh, that's so pretty it could have you floating off into a nice little nap there. It's an enjoyable recording of post-bop material with an overall relaxed atmosphere. Nice solos all around from Serra, Gonzalez, and Gagliardo. Sometimes recordings with piano and vibes get crowded and muddled because the instruments work a lot of the same register, but I never get that feeling here. Serra and Gagliardo complement each other, and there's a nice sense of space in the arrangements. Campos and Colomer keep it tight on drums and bass, and each one gets a little spot to shine through on their own. But what I think makes this recording special is the program. It's mostly covers of original compositions by jazz greats. Sometimes we get 1 or 2 on a recording mixed with some standards, but having 7 of them here was very nice, and great choices by Horace Silver, Tom Harrell, George Cables, Ronnie Matthews, and, of course, Kenny Barron. Some of our favorites. And not to forget the original by the pianist here, Juan Gagliardo.
I was hooked by Serra's gorgeous vibraphone tone right from the beginning. It's full sounding with a decent sustain to it, and it's well captured on this recording right up front. It gives the album a really classy feel, as does the sensual sax playing. Vibes and sax often play themes together on the album, all sound great together, I especially enjoyed Serra's solo foray on Silent Rain, the final track. The piano matches the classy playing of Serra, and bass has melodic ideas and solos, and the drums get busy and hard-hitting when needed. It's good music making all around, but Serra's really the star here. It's one of the most appealing vibraphone tones I've heard, and I looked for a CD of this, but information on this album is hard to track down on the internet, and there doesn't seem to be a CD anyway. If there was, it would be on my playlist and my shelf for years to come, I think.
Yeah, this one puts you in a good mood, and it's got a nice relaxed vibe to it all over.
Right.
All right, we're going to stay in Europe, but we're going to hop over to France for our next recording called In a World. It's by clarinetist Benjamin Fried and his group Scent of Lilacs, and this also came out on April 12th. This is released under his own name. There's not much information about Fried online, except that he studied at Haute École de Musique, as did some of the other musicians on this recording. There is a little French description of the music, which I translated to English, and it's particularly insightful. Scent of Lilacs is a sextet created by clarinetist Benjamin Fried. It is based on the association of a wind instrument section, trombone, clarinet, and flute, with a classic jazz trio, piano, bass, and drums. Often found in South American music and early 20th century symphonic music, the combination of clarinet and flute is supported and enriched here by the presence of the trombone, echoing the sound of traditional old-school jazz. In this way, the sextet's sound palette is very open, offering multiple musical reference points for the listener. The sextet relies on a group of musicians with a very similar background and vision of the same artistic idea, blending the impressionist universe of Ravel and Debussy, modal jazz, and the influences of McCoy Tyner and Wayne Shorter. You got all that in your head now, bouncing around? Sounds intriguing, right? Well, that's mostly what caught my ear here, the wonderful palette of sounds. You know, the French always know how to make timbres sound lovely, and also there's some nice impressionistic touches that are intriguing here, mixed with a modern jazz sentiment. The one video of Fried's YouTube channel credits him with the composition, so I'll assume that all except for the standard that's on the last track here are his original compositions. So Benjamin Fried, clarinet, Arthur Tanguy on flute, Victor Decamp, trombone, Mirko Maio on piano, Emilio Giovanoli on bass, and Fabien Girotto on drums. The recording starts out with Flying Mountains Part 1, and we'll get some great tonal blends right from the start, with just the horns coming in and then being joined by bass. When the piano and drums join in, the clarinet and flute get into rippling wave-like figures for Decamp's trombone to waft lyrical lines over. Let's check out this dreamy atmosphere. Well, that's quite a beautiful start. I was hooked right away.
Yeah, that circling wind pattern just kind of reminds me of that moment in Ravel's ballet, Daphnis and Chloe, when the sun rises, Le Ver du Jour, really beautiful.
And on this tune, also, Fried has a really liquid-sounding clarinet solo, and I want to check out a little bit of that before we move on as well. clarinet solo, there's a section of arranged horns where the piano takes that rippling figure idea we heard in the woodwinds earlier, and then the arrangement gets interesting with the woodwinds working together against the trombone with some fun fluttering from Tanguy. Interesting right to the end. Track 2, Flying Mountains Part 2, a loping swing beat under a melody started by flute. Fried takes the next section, but the flute is in for layers, and finally trombone is into the lines as well. Tanguy has the first improvised solo, so let's hear some of that. I like that nice syncopated backing figure from the other winds that breaks things up, and that will come back in the other solo, which is Mayo on piano, and his solo has a lot of rhythmic playfulness. The final section slows and becomes rubato with a little reprise of the trombone lines and the rippling woodwind figures we heard in part 1. Track 3 is called Deadline, 2 words. Playful clarinet over drums starts this out into a full arrangement of the horns, but each instrument gets phrases that stand out. Let's hear it get going. And into a piano solo from Mayo there. He gets into some percussive modal chord playing with exciting lines. Fried has a clarinet solo broken up with new tightly arranged sections of horn lines, ending up just over the drums like at the start, with a similar arrangement of horn interaction on the melody to the end. A very interesting arrangement here. Track 4, 3 Waves, Part 1, an intro of ringing rhythmic piano before the horn arrangement comes in with dreamy modal melody lines. It seems to be in a 10/4 meter, but changes up with a few measures of 8 beats on the way. Let's have a listen. De Camp has a delicate but rhythmic trombone solo with some cool licks and pitch play, so let's hear some of that too. Siegfried follows with a clarinet solo, and I really like the drumming excitement of Grotto underneath it. The beat falls away for a bit as a new syncopated horn arrangement starts into a drum solo from Grotto, and he unwinds it to the end, connecting to the next track, which is Three Waves Part 2. This is a slow ballad with some delicious wah-wah melody lines from De Kamp's trombone. A faster tempo emerges in rhythmic piano figures from Mayo into a syncopated horn arrangement. It gets quiet over bouncy bass figures for some improvised piano and gradually builds energy and tension with a tight beat and fills from Grotto. Let's check out a little bit of that action later on in the tune. Are back there with a slowed ending phrase. And track 6 is Three Waves Part 3. The winds start this out over bowed bass with rubato lines and more wah-wah on the trombone. Let's hear what that sounds like. Switches up there with a straight rocky beat and a horn arrangement. It seems to switch up between 3-beat and 4-beat measures, but things get trickier with a momentary switch to a swing feel and then some syncopated trombone and weaving flute lines into a flute solo with a lot of fun articulation. Clarinet and trombone are back for a section to a pause and then return to the opening rubato idea over bowed bass with some final soft rhythmic piano. Track 7, Dancing Lanes for Serra. Flute and muted trombone start this relaxed waltz number out. When the rhythm section comes in, Fried takes over the melody that gets doubled by the bass. It's interesting and delicate. Let's hear it get going. guitars added there as it moves along. Giovanelli gets a bass solo, and then Fried has a clarinet solo again with that nice liquid tone. It gets more rhythmic and swinging. Flute and muted trombone are back to join in on another melody section. Track 8 is called Smile Valley, a Latin samba-type feel for this one with a happy horn arrangement and a little bluesy twist. Fried is up first for a clarinet solo, then De Camp on trombone, Mayo on piano, and finally Tanguy on flute. Let's check out some of his flute solo on this tune. And the horns have interjections into some tight drum soloing from Garato back into the melody. And the recording ends up with track 9, Smoke Gets in Your Eyes. This is a Jerome Kern tune all the way back to 1933 for the Broadway musical Roberta. First recorded by Paul Whiteman, but Charlie Parker and Sarah Vaughan recorded it as well. And don't forget the 1958 version by the Platters. Here it's just flute and clarinet as a duo, with the flute taking the melody first and then Fried's clarinet while the other player weaves lines of harmony. Let's hear it get started. Yeah, some nice tension in the passing tones there. Well, this is the kind of recording that will go under the radar, and you wouldn't find it unless you look every day at the independent releases that come out like I do, and I'm glad I found it. Unique instrumentation, a French sensibility to timbre, unique and well thought out arrangements on Fried's original compositions. There are shades of impressionistic ideas with modern modal harmonies, post-bop excitement with swinging and Latin rhythmic variety. And the solos are inspired, all with fine technique, especially from the winds. I think I'll be listening to this one quite a bit.
Yeah, this is a nice find. It's rather unusual for a jazz album with the prominence of clarinet and flute and wind harmonies on all the tracks. Even the drum sound came up as something different. The bass drum is more felt than heard. The winds provide a lot of classical-sounding arabesques during tracks and provide some uplifting solos, too. I mentioned one of the arabesques reminded me of Ravel's Daphnis and Chloe, the famous Le Ver du Jour part. If you know that work, it's from Suite No. 2. The pastel-like timbre of the album was the biggest draw for me. Jazz albums just don't come with these sounds.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I was captivated. I wouldn't mind having this on a CD either, but I did a quick search and couldn't come up with this one either, so I hope they'll put it out on a CD.
Yeah, I don't know. It's on his own label, so we'll send him a note and see if he has any plans to get it out there on physical media. All right, and for our final album, we'll come back to North America. Well, the recording label's Canadian, but we've got American saxophonist David Schumacher and his group Cubi. Smoke in the Sky on Cellar Live. This also came out April 12th. Chicago native David Schumacher has been on the New York jazz scene for more than 40 years. During the 1980s, he toured the world with Lionel Hampton's orchestra, and he spent almost 2 decades as a member of the orchestra of Harry Connick Jr. In the 90s, he toured with T.S. Monk's Monk on Monk band, that's Thelonious Monk's son, a drummer, and the Tom Harrell Octet, as well as many others in the New York area and also on the road. In his days with Lionel Hampton, he developed an interest in the history of Afro-Cuban music from rooming on tours with the band's percussionist, conguero Sam Seguito Turner. He's included Afro-Cuban tunes on previous recordings, but this is his first all-Latin jazz release with a lineup of musicians well-versed in both Latin and jazz traditions. And Schumacher says that 2 of the biggest influences on this recording, as far as musical concept go, are Jerry Gonzalez and the Fort Apache Band and Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. For our lineup, we've got Dave Schumacher on baritone saxophone, Josh Evans on trumpet, tracks 1 and 5 through 8. Also, Jesus Ricardo on trumpet on tracks 2 and 3. Peter Brainin on tenor and soprano saxophones on track 1 and track 5 through 8. Manuel Valera, a pianist we've heard quite a bit on the podcast on different recordings. Alex Apollo Ayala on bass. Mauricio Herrera, congas and percussion. And Joel Mateo on drums and bells. Executive producer over at Cellar Live, as always, Corey Weeds, and also Dave Schumacher. Produced by Dave Schumacher, co-produced by Hector Davila, also known as Chegui Mitraya, if I said that right. And the recording was done at Trading 8's studio, April 19th and June 13th of 2023. Engineered by Chris Sulit, also mixed by Chris Sulit and Hector Davila. Mastered by Oscar Autier at El Cerrito Records. The recording begins with the title track, Smoke in the Sky, a Schumacher original. In the notes, Schumacher says, I was hearing the melody and harmony of this date's 4th track, his ballad, No More Smoke in the Sky, over an up-tempo groove. More on the meaning of the song's title when we get to that track, but here it's done in an up-tempo Latin feel. Brass and piano lines started out. Latin percussion comes in for a cool groove before the horns are in on melody lines broken up by Valera's piano. Let's hear it get started. Josh Evans is up first for an exciting trumpet solo, starting out with some staccato notes and nice weaving lines through the harmonies, but let's get a sense of Schumacher's style and come back for his bari sax solo on this tune. Energetic playing with lines digging way down low. Valera has a piano solo on this tune as well, and the horns come in with backing figures into a percussion build-up section. Then it's back to the opening bass and piano line ideas into the melody again. It's an exciting start with a tight arrangement. Track 2 is called You Know It's Wrong. This is a composition by Eddie Harris from his 1980 recording Sounds Incredible. It's originally a 4/4 shuffle tune, but here it's reimagined in a 6/8 groove. That groove gives the melody a unique kind of phrasing. Let's check out how it comes out. Schumacher's off on a solo from there. Ayala gets a bass solo too, and Valera works up a riff with percussion back into another run through the melody. It's a short tune at less than 3.5 minutes. Track 3, Caridad. This is a song by Afro Cuba de Matanzas, one of Cuba's top folkloric groups from their Raíces Africanas album. Schumacher starts it out solo on the Big Berry with bluesy lines joined by drums and percussion. Ricardo is on trumpet, joining sax lines to a pause on the intro. Let's hear it get going. Yeah, a new tempo to start the main section of the tune with some meandering bass and piano lines. The horns handle the jagged melody lines with agility, and then the horns have some exchanged lines between phrases where they come together with some rhythm section intervals breaking things up. Ricardo has a trumpet solo on this tune as well. Schumacher follows with his own solo, and Valera has his own as well. The horns are back with more melody lines and exchanges, and the final section gets some additional rhythmic excitement with percussion and rhythmic piano from Valera getting it set up. Track 4, No More, in parentheses, Smoke in the Sky. So here's the melody from track 1 in its original ballad form. The title is inspired by Schumacher seeing smoke in the sky in Los Angeles in 1992 on the day that the Rodney King case verdict was released, and also a flashback to a memory of his childhood apartment in Chicago in 1968, looking at smoke rising in the sky on the day that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. The melody gets broken up in the first track when we heard it, but here let's take a listen to Schumacher's lyrical exposition of it. continues on with improvised lines from there. Valera has a delicate piano solo with smooth running lines in the upper register, and Ayala has a ringing bass solo too, before Schumacher's back with a final shorter melody section to finish it. Track 5, El Dilema de Chegui Matraya, another Schumacher original, and so this is a tribute to Hector Davila, who is Schumacher's close friend and the album's co-producer. Evans is back on trumpet on this tune with Brainin on tenor. It starts with a Latin groove and kind of menacing minor horn lines over percolating bass and piano underneath. The final section has a sudden short change to swing with chasing horn lines. Let's check out Valera's solo on this one as it changes back to a Latin groove, but the swing will return. Exciting piano there, and Brainin gets a tenor solo next, then Schumacher, who really works it up when the grooves switch up. Ayala has a bass solo as well, with speedy and forceful articulation, and the horns are back with the melody lines, and then Mateo and Herrera get to work up the percussion over some piano and bass vamping before the final horn lines. Track 6 is called Cal Massey. This is a composition from pianist Stanley Cowell from his 1972 recording Illusion Suite. It's a tribute to the Philadelphia trumpeter Cal Massey. Schumacher says, "One of my absolute favorite albums is Clifford Jordan's Glass Bead Games on Strata East," and Cowell was the pianist on that recording as well, which features this tune. Schumacher made this special arrangement with this new groove we hear here. The melody has a repeating horn riff surrounded by descending horn figures. Schumacher solos first with a gutsy baritone, and let's check out Evans's exciting trumpet solo on this one with some agile chromaticism from about a minute and a half into the tune. Brainin gets a tenor solo as well, and Valera follows on piano with some really zippy running lines in his solo. Horn hits punctuate a drum and percussion section that we might as well check out too on this tune because it's a lot of fun. And back to the main melody from there. Track 7, Walk Spirit, Talk Spirit. This is a McCoy Tyner tune from his 1973 album Enlightenment. You can also hear it on his 1981 La Leyenda de la Hora with Paquito de Rivera. Schumacher says, I bought McCoy's Enlightenment as a freshman in high school in 1974, and Walk Spirit, Talk Spirit became an immediate favorite of mine. Well, this is a rumba take on this tune here, but first Ayala gets it started with an extended solo bass intro. Let's check that out. Piano and percussion get some more intro time before the horns are in on an arrangement of the melody. Valera's piano fills between phrases are exciting, and he has an exciting solo on this one. Braden takes a solo on soprano sax, and we haven't heard a sample of his playing yet, so let's check out what he does on this tune. Exciting lines over that great groove. Evans gets a solo on this one too, before Schumacher takes the last solo spot with some fun honks before he's all done. The horns are back for more melody into another extended section for Schumacher to do some more improvising to a fade out. It's the longest track at over 11 minutes.
No, I'll give him this fade out because it's such a long track.
Yeah. And the album ends up with Poinciana, a Nat Simon tune, first released by David Rose and his orchestra back in 1942. Schumacher says of this, quote, "Of course, Ahmad Jamal's classic version is the first thing that comes to mind when thinking of Poinciana, but I had also been listening to a killing live Sonny Rollins bootleg playing in a different vibe." So his arrangement here considers those versions and a confluence of Latin influences. I think he came up with something pretty cool here. Ayala gets it started with a bass groove. I like the smoothly phrased bari sax melody line under the rhythmic horn figures. Let's check it out. Yeah, and a nice change up there to a swinging section. Oh, this is the last track, so let's jump back in for one more Barry sax solo from Schumacher. To stop there, but it's going on and on. Evans has a trumpet solo on this one too, with some high reaches and speedy licks. Brandon gets a tenor solo as well, and Herrera and Mateo get to build up some percussive energy under some vamping before they get back to the melody and some improvised lines from Schumacher, and then Valera has the final say with a lot of exciting final piano improvisations too, a fade out. A mix of tunes from interesting sources as well as Schumacher's original compositions and two contrasting settings of the title melody. His Barry sax playing is full-toned and confident with energetic solos throughout. Lots of other great solos too, especially from Valera and Evans. Ayala, Herrera, and Mateo inject every tune with lots of great Latin grooves, and Schumacher's arrangements are fun, giving the horns lots of interplay. The album kind of opens up more with the final tracks, allowing for more extended blowing. Latin jazz and Barry sax, it's an irresistible combination.
Yeah, I thought this was a pleasant, enjoyable album with comfortable tempos up until the last two tracks. Now, it's not a sparks flying type of Latin jazz album at the beginning, but at the end, by the end it is. I found the first 6 tracks to be of high in melodic quality and composition, thematic shaping, soloing. Latin percussion always has so many intriguing rhythmic details to listen to, and that's the case here. I thought David Schumacher's best solo on this album was El Diema de Chagul Matraya, where he provides some rhythmic heat and passion in his solo, and the band responds. By the time we get to Walk Spirit, Talk Spirit, the band seems inspired to play out with passion. The neckties are loosened from the beginning of the album. That track came across like a big party to me, and the album concluding Provinciana keeps that energy. The album begins sounding rather buttoned up, but in the last 2 and longest tracks, the energy picks up considerably, and we're more in Latin jazz party mode. Both tracks fade, but they're pretty long, so I'll give them that. I usually don't like it when tracks fade in jazz, but I think overall I would have liked this to be one or the other, either like buttoned up or, really letting its hair down. Either neatly melodic or passionately fiery, but it certainly ends in high spirits, and it left me feeling good. And I'm wondering, is there a CD of this?
Oh, sure. Cellar Live, yeah.
This one has. Okay, Cellar Live. Okay. Have to look into that.
Yeah. Always good to have some Latin jazz, and it's been a while.
And Barry sax. Boy.
And Barry sax.
Boy, what a combination.
Yeah. 2 of our favorite things. All right. And that will wrap it up for episode 161 of Adult Music. Thanks as always to Fast Signs of Staten Island for our glowing neon logo, and be sure to check out the Same Difference 2 Jazz Fans 1 Jazz Standard podcast. Their promo will be coming up when we finish speaking here. And as we said at the beginning, don't miss next week's episode with special guest host, guitarist Jason Kaiser, and we'll get his insights into 3 recordings. We've got some classical music.
Marco Giannoni with his own compositions there.
Complete works for solo guitar, played by Fabrizio Proietti. Yeah. And then we're going to have 2 guitar organ trio recordings. We've got Red Room, that's from a Greek organ trio, and that's going to be interesting. They're both George Contraforos sort of disciples, and we'll see what's going on in Greece. And then we've got the great young guitarist Mike Clement and his new recording, Hitting It. And we really liked his debut album. And now he's over on Cellar Live, and he stepped up his game with an exciting recording. So we'll get Jason's ideas on that music, and then he'll talk us through his release, which is coming out next Friday, Grassology.
Yeah, and we'll tell him what we thought of it too.
Yeah.
Should be interesting.
So I'll put the other 3 recordings into our playlist for the week, so you can find that on Deezer. Also a link to it on our Facebook page. And then I'll add Jason's recording when it comes out on Friday if you want to check it out right away. Any final words, Mike?
Yeah, when making a translation, the meaning is more important than the rhyme. Keep to the meaning.
That's right.
Yeah, it's driving me crazy. I've been thinking about that all podcast long.
All right, so we'll be back with our exciting guest co-host Jason Kaiser next week. And until then, keep listening.
Same difference. 2 jazz fans, 1 jazz standard. A review of a single jazz standard through music, history, and stories. And this is AJ.
And this is Johnny.
If you are a jazz fan and you like jazz standards, bebop, show tunes, ballads, you name it.
Yeah, we've got them here. We drop a new show on you every other week, and we take a standard and we listen to a few different versions of it.
Same difference.
Come join the fun.
Looking forward to seeing you.